Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, and it's not coming from the opposition. For the first time, Republicans themselves are pushing back against Donald Trump, quietly moving to block the power he's trying to hold on to at any cost. Emergency declarations, war-level rhetoric, and behind-the-scenes panic are colliding as Congress steps in to draw a line. This isn't just another political fight or a breaking news moment. It's a test of whether American power is ruled by law or by one man's instincts. Stay until the end, because what's unfolding here could reshape how power works in the United States long after the headlines fade. So imagine this moment, late at night in Washington, phones lighting up across Capitol Hill, aides whispering, senators checking their screens twice to make sure what they're reading is real. Because the President of the United States is furious, not at Democrats, not at the media, but at his own party. And for the first time in a long time, the rebellion isn't coming from protesters outside the gates. It's coming from inside the walls, and that's where the real danger always begins. Because right now, Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump. And no, this isn't just the usual MAGA infighting or anonymous leaks meant to scare donors. This is something deeper, colder, and far more consequential, because it cuts directly into the one thing Trump believes he cannot live without: unchecked power. And the reason this revolt matters is not just that some supporters feel betrayed over broken promises, whether it's the vow of no new wars or the soaring cost of living or the lingering unanswered questions surrounding long-promised disclosures that never seem to arrive. It's that Republican lawmakers themselves are beginning to openly move against the very authority Trump is desperate to cling to. And when that happens, when the guardrails inside the system start to activate, presidents don't respond calmly. They escalate, they dramatize, they declare emergencies. And that's exactly what we're watching unfold right now. A presidency leaning hard into spectacle and crisis language to protect itself from internal collapse. Because at the heart of this entire revolt is a simple but terrifying reality that even seasoned Washington veterans are struggling to process out loud. The President of the United States has been publicly entertaining the idea of using military force in ways that could drag America into conflict, not with some distant adversary, but with its own allies. And when Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in blunt terms, it landed like a shockwave, because once you strip away the bluster and the branding, what you're left with is a scenario that sounds absurd until you remember we've stopped being allowed to dismiss these statements as jokes, because Greenland is not a blank space on a real estate map. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, and NATO's core principle is collective defense, meaning that any military action against that territory isn't just symbolic, it's a legal and strategic nightmare that theoretically places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. And the fact that lawmakers are now having to seriously explain this to the public is itself a sign of how unmoored the conversation has become, because no one in America voted for a presidency that risks a shooting war with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. And yet here we are, parsing comments, weighing hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it's kicked open. And this is where Trump's worldview becomes critical to understanding the backlash, because he doesn't process geopolitics as alliances or treaties or shared security obligations. He processes it like property, like leverage, like a deal that can be forced if you push hard enough. And that mindset might work in a boardroom, but in global politics, it gets people killed. And Republican senators know this. They understand that once a president frames military action as an option, the machinery starts moving whether Congress likes it or not, which is why the War Powers Act suddenly became the battlefield, not as an abstract constitutional debate, but as an emergency brake. And when that brake was pulled, when Republicans joined Democrats to advance a resolution limiting the president's ability to act unilaterally, Trump didn't respond with negotiation or persuasion. He responded with rage, profanity, and threats, because that's what happens when someone who believes power is personal realizes it's actually conditional. And the reported phone call to Senator Susan Collins wasn't just about one vote. It was about the shock of discovering that loyalty has limits, that even in his own party there are lines that can't be crossed without resistance. And for Trump, that resistance feels existential because his entire second-term strategy hinges on projecting strength, inevitability, and control, and nothing undermines that faster than members of your own party publicly telling you no, especially when the issue at stake is war, authority, and constitutional boundaries. And this is where the narrative accelerates because faced with pushback, Trump doesn't retreat, he reframes, he reaches for the language of emergency, declaring extraordinary measures not just as policy tools but as political weapons, and the declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits perfectly into this pattern because it allows him to cast himself as the sole protector of national security while portraying dissenting lawmakers as obstacles, even though the underlying reality is far more complicated, involving long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would flow primarily to multinational energy companies rather than ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the point. The point is dominance, distraction, and control of the narrative, because emergencies change the rules. Emergencies centralize authority, and emergencies shift attention away from uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why long-promised transparency efforts have stalled, why document releases have been delayed, and why it took bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to move certain oversight actions forward. And when lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse start talking openly about inspectors general, compliance failures, and unanswered timelines, it signals something important. Not a conclusion, not an accusation, but concern that process itself has broken down, and that concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford, because his political survival depends not just on winning arguments, but on exhausting the public, flooding the zone, and keeping every controversy competing for oxygen. And that's why these threads, Republican revolt, war powers, emergency declarations, and stalled disclosures, aren't separate stories. They're the same story viewed from different angles. A presidency trying to outrun accountability by accelerating chaos, and Republicans who once waved everything through are now calculating the cost of silence, weighing institutional damage against party loyalty, and realizing that if they don't act now, they may not recognize the system later. Because once a president openly suggests he is guided only by his own judgment and not by law, treaties, or precedent, the question stops being partisan and becomes structural, and that's the moment we're in, a moment where behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is an act of betrayal or an act of preservation, because history doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest, it remembers who stepped in when the rules were bending past their breaking point. And this revolt, quiet in some places, explosive in others, may be the first real sign that the internal guardrails are finally being tested not by the opposition, but by those who know exactly how dangerous unchecked power can become when it's wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and the language of permanent emergency. And as this internal rebellion deepens, the real story shifts from what Donald Trump is saying publicly to what Republicans are doing privately, because behind the cameras, behind the social media outrage and the carefully worded statements, there is a growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency, but with a leader who sees every institutional limit as a personal insult. And that realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year ago, because when the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican votes, it wasn't an accident or a momentary lapse in party discipline. It was a calculated move by senators who understand that once the executive branch normalizes unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. And that fear is not ideological, it's constitutional, because the War Powers Act exists precisely for moments like this, moments when a president's instincts outrun the system's safeguards, and the fact that Trump reacted with profanity, intimidation, and threats of political destruction only reinforce the concern that his decision-making process is driven less by strategy and more by impulse, grievance, and legacy. Obsession and legacy is a critical word here because Trump's fixation on being remembered, on being seen as dominant, transformative, and historically consequential, has increasingly collided with the reality that his promises have not translated into stability, prosperity, or restraint. And when the myth of no new wars collapses under the weight of military rhetoric, even loyal supporters begin to fracture because wars are not abstractions to voters, they are costs, risks, and consequences, and Republicans up for re-election understand that no amount of branding can sell a conflict with allies as a victory, which is why Trump's turn toward emergency powers feels less like leadership and more like panic, because emergencies allow him to bypass debate, marginalize dissent, and recast opposition as sabotage. And this tactic has a long history, not just in American politics, but globally, where leaders who feel their authority slipping reach for extraordinary measures to freeze the political moment in their favor. And in Trump's case, the Venezuelan oil emergency is a textbook example of how economic assets are framed as security imperatives, even when the practical benefits are distant, uncertain, and largely corporate, because the language of emergency is not about timelines or feasibility, it's about optics, control, and narrative dominance. And while the administration insists this move is about protecting American interests, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle see something else. A strategic distraction designed to shift attention away from congressional oversight, internal party dissent, and growing scrutiny of executive follow-through. And this is where Trump's relationship with his own party becomes increasingly adversarial, because he doesn't just want support, he demands submission, and when senators assert independence, he treats it as betrayal rather than governance, publicly threatening their careers while privately depending on their votes for judicial confirmations, legislative priorities, and institutional cover. And that contradiction exposes the fragility of his position, because power that relies on fear rather than coalition eventually turns inward. And we're watching that process unfold in real time as Republican senators quietly coordinate, compare notes, and decide when and how to draw lines that were once unthinkable to draw. And this internal calculation is fueled by a broader concern that Trump's rhetoric about law, morality, and authority is no longer symbolic but operational, because when a president suggests he is governed by personal judgment rather than international law or constitutional constraint, it signals a worldview in which rules exist only when convenient. And that worldview terrifies lawmakers who understand that precedent outlives presidencies, because if these norms collapse now, they won't magically reappear later. And this anxiety has turned routine votes into flashpoints, phone calls into confrontations, and policy disagreements into existential tests of institutional survival. And all of this is happening against a backdrop of mounting public confusion and fatigue, where voters struggle to separate spectacle from substance. And that confusion is not accidental, it's strategic, because a crowded information environment benefits those who thrive on chaos. And Trump has always understood that if everything is breaking news, nothing is accountable. Which is why the convergence of these stories matters so much, because the war powers fight, the emergency declaration, the Republican revolt, and the stalled disclosures are not isolated controversies. They are interconnected stress fractures in a system being pushed beyond its design. And Republicans who once rationalized every action as temporary or tactical are now confronting the possibility that silence is no longer neutral, that inaction itself becomes a form of consent, and that realization has changed the tone inside the party from loyalty to triage, because they are no longer asking how to help Trump win the next news cycle. They are asking how to prevent irreversible damage to the institutions they still need to function after he is gone. And that shift, subtle but profound, is why this revolt feels different. Quieter in some ways, but far more serious, because it's driven not by ideology, but by alarm, by lawmakers who understand that when emergency powers become routine and war rhetoric becomes casual, the line between governance and authoritarianism blurs. And once that line disappears, it rarely comes back without a cost. And that cost is what Republicans are now trying, perhaps belatedly, to avoid, even as Trump escalates attacks and frames every check on his power as an attack on the nation itself, because in his mind the two are inseparable. And that belief, more than any single policy or controversy, is what has finally pushed members of his own party into open resistance, setting the stage for an internal confrontation that will define not just this presidency, but the future balance of power long after the headlines fade. And while the public argument rages over war powers and emergency declarations, a quieter, more unsettling pressure is building beneath the surface, because every time the administration escalates the language of crisis, it inadvertently shines a light on what it seems most eager to outrun: oversight, documentation, timelines, and the slow, methodical work of accountability. And this is where the story takes a darker, more procedural turn, not into conspiracy or rumor, but into the uncomfortable territory of process failures and unanswered questions, because when lawmakers begin asking why promised disclosures are delayed, why reviews stretch on indefinitely, and why statutory deadlines slip without explanation, they aren't alleging conclusions, they're identifying red flags, and red flags are dangerous not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they invite scrutiny. And scrutiny is the one thing a presidency built on speed, spectacle, and dominance struggles to manage. And that's why the discussion around delayed document releases has become so sensitive, because the administration itself elevated these disclosures into a defining promise, signaling urgency, prioritization, and transparency, only for reality to unfold far more slowly than rhetoric suggested. And when senators like Sheldon Whitehouse begin publicly describing the gap between expectation and execution, emphasizing numbers, timelines, and compliance requirements rather than theories, it reframes the issue entirely, turning it from a political talking point into an administrative credibility test. And that shift matters because credibility is the currency of governance. And once it's questioned, every subsequent explanation faces higher skepticism. And the request for Inspector General review isn't an accusation. It's an admission that something in the process went wrong, whether through mismanagement, delay, or conflicting priorities. And for an administration already battling internal revolt, that kind of inquiry compounds the pressure, because inspectors general operate outside political theater, dealing in memos, records, and chains of decision-making, and their work doesn't disappear with a tweet or a rally. And this is where Trump's strategy becomes clearer, not in any single statement, but in the pattern of escalation, because whenever scrutiny tightens, the narrative widens, emergencies are declared, external threats are emphasized, and the conversation shifts from documentation to dominance, from compliance to confrontation, and it's not subtle, it's instinctive. A reflex honed over decades: flood the zone, change the subject, raise the stakes, and hope the audience moves on. But Congress isn't an audience, it's a co-equal branch, and some lawmakers are beginning to behave like it again, pressing for subpoenas, following financial trails, and asking why certain avenues weren't pursued proactively if transparency was truly the priority. And again, this isn't about proving an outcome, it's about explaining a process, and processes don't have feelings, they have records, and records are stubborn because they don't care how loudly anyone insists on their own version of events. And the deeper this inquiry goes, the more it threatens to collide with Trump's preferred mode of operation, which is personal control over narrative rather than institutional disclosure. And that collision is what he fears, because it limits his ability to redefine reality on demand. And this fear explains why the rhetoric around loyalty has intensified, why dissent is framed as sabotage, and why even bipartisan oversight is portrayed as partisan warfare. Because once you accept neutral review, you accept the possibility of outcomes you can't control. And Trump has always treated control as synonymous with survival. And this brings us back to why Republicans themselves are so uneasy, because they can see the convergence forming: war powers being challenged, emergency powers being scrutinized, disclosure processes being questioned, and internal party unity fraying all at once. And they understand that this isn't just a bad news cycle, it's a systems test, one that asks whether institutions still function when pressure comes from the top rather than the outside. And some Republicans are now quietly acknowledging that the real risk isn't what investigators might find, But what happens if oversight fails entirely because a system that can't examine itself becomes brittle? And brittle systems don't bend, they shatter, and this awareness has shifted the internal conversation from defense to distance, from justification to insulation, as lawmakers calculate how to separate their own constitutional responsibilities from a presidency that increasingly treats those responsibilities as obstacles, and all the while, Trump continues to push forward, framing himself as besieged, misunderstood, and unfairly constrained, leaning harder into the language of destiny and personal judgment, even as the institutional machinery around him begins to hum louder, slower, and more deliberately, because oversight doesn't rush. It accumulates, and that accumulation is what keeps him awake. Because no matter how many crises are declared or enemies named, paper trails don't vanish, deadlines don't forget, and processes don't care about loyalty. And that's why this moment feels heavier than previous controversies, because it's no longer about what Trump says or tweets, it's about what he can't fully control. And for a leader whose authority has always flowed from dominating the narrative, the quiet persistence of oversight may be the most destabilizing force he's faced yet, setting the stage for a final confrontation not over ideology or elections, but over whether the institutions he governs are still allowed to govern him. And this is where the story ultimately lands, not in a single vote, not in a single phone call, not even in a single emergency declaration, but in a reckoning that Republicans, Democrats, and the public alike can no longer postpone, because what we are watching is not just a clash of personalities or a cycle of outrage, it's a stress test of whether American governance still functions when pressure comes from inside the highest office rather than from outside threats. And the reason this moment feels different, heavier, more consequential is that the resistance is no longer purely partisan. It's institutional, it's procedural, it's driven by lawmakers who may disagree on ideology, but increasingly agree on one uncomfortable truth: that power justified only by personal will, insulated by emergency language, and defended through intimidation eventually, turns against the very system that grants it legitimacy. And Republicans know this, even if they won't all say it out loud, because they understand that today's shortcuts become tomorrow's precedents, and once those precedents exist, they don't belong to one man or one party anymore. They belong to whoever comes next. And that realization has transformed quiet unease into cautious action. Votes cast not for applause but for restraint. Oversight requests framed not as attacks but as necessities. And distance created not out of disloyalty but out of self-preservation, because history is unforgiving to those who confuse silence with neutrality. And Trump, for all his bravado, senses this shift, which is why his rhetoric has grown sharper, his framing more apocalyptic, and his reliance on emergency powers more pronounced. Because leaders who feel control slipping don't slow down, they accelerate, they raise the stakes, they demand loyalty tests, and they insist that only they can protect the nation from collapse, even as their own actions create the instability they warn against. And that paradox is at the center of this presidency's final act: a leader obsessed with legacy but increasingly boxed in by process, a party torn between short-term alignment and long-term survival, and institutions forced to choose whether they will be performative or functional when it matters most. And for the audience watching this unfold, the temptation is to treat it as just another chapter in a long-running political drama, but that would miss the point entirely, because the real question isn't whether Trump wins the next argument or dominates the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern power are still stronger than the people who temporarily hold it. And that question doesn't belong to politicians alone. It belongs to voters, to citizens, to anyone who expects stability rather than spectacle from leadership. And as this revolt continues, as oversight grinds forward, and as emergency narratives collide with constitutional limits, the outcome will tell us something profound about where American democracy actually stands, not in theory, but in practice, because systems don't fail all at once. They erode gradually, challenged, tested, and normalized until someone finally says no. And right now, that know is coming not from the outside but from within, from Republicans who understand that stopping a leader from going too far is not betrayal, it's responsibility, and whether that responsibility holds under pressure will shape not just this presidency but the rules every future president inherits, which is why this moment matters so much, why it deserves attention beyond outrage, and why it demands engagement, scrutiny, and conversation. Because democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky, and that defense, quiet or loud, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines, one that will be written not by declarations or threats, but by the choices made when power meets its limits, and the world is watching to see whether those limits still mean something.